A new report by the international charity Oxfam paints a downbeat picture about increasing inequality in West Africa, saying that it is at crisis levels, especially in Nigeria. The charity says that the 5 richest men in Nigeria have a total wealth of nearly $30 billion in a country where almost 2/3 live on little more than $1 a day. We'll speak to 2 senior officers from Oxfam. And later, the outspoken former senator and civil society activist Shehu Sani will be in the studio talking about his stalled political career and sharing his thoughts about all the current controversial political, economic and social issues that appear to be getting in the way of good governance in Nigeria. He's not a shy one and he won't be intimidated. Senator Shehu Sani and a lot more coming up. We begin, though, with that scathing report from Oxfam. The international aid charity says that inequality is at crisis levels in West Africa. In a new report, Oxfam accuses many governments in the region of ignoring the issue despite considerable economic growth. It says that a small number of people in West Africa are growing fantastically rich. So rich, in fact, that the wealthiest 1% own more than everyone else in the region combined. The charity says the 5 richest men in Nigeria, for instance, have a total wealth of nearly $30 billion in a country where almost 2/3 live on little more than $1 a day. It says such wealth is often hidden away and untaxed. But it also praises a number of countries, including Senegal, Mauritania and Cape Verde, as the states most committed to reducing inequality. Well, in a moment, we'll speak with 2 senior officers from Oxfam in West Africa. And in fact, those 2 officers are with me now. The Oxfam's lead partner, who is on inequality, and his name is Hamzat Lawal, and also I'm joined by Kwesi Obeng, who is from Oxfam's regional office in Dakar, Senegal. Thank you very much indeed to both of you for coming in. You've painted a very bleak picture of the situation in West Africa. Some of the statistics from your report are just shocking and very sad, that just 1% of the population, for example, in Nigeria, are as wealthy as the rest of the populace.
Oh, yes. And this is worrisome because we can't live in a region where, or for instance in Nigeria, where a lot of people live below 300 naira a day, when only 1% of the populace have wealth combined together of the countries in the West African region. And for us, it's about raising that bar high and bringing this issue to the front burner, because if it continues like this, that means social vices in the West African region would continue. Today, we're experiencing crisis with the insurgency in the Lake Chad region. Today, you have women that don't have access to healthcare needs. Today, we have increasing childbirth and maternal mortality. This is also fueling the inequality crisis. Today in the history of the world, we have the growing numbers of unemployed young people. So what this means is these young people could easily be recruited into insurgencies, and government would keep spending billions of taxpayers' money to buy ammunition rather than providing resources on reducing inequality in the region. And
Mr. Obeng, you are part of the group that put this report together. As far as the broader sort of West Africa is concerned, is it that staggering inequality that motivated Oxfam to launch this report?
Yeah, I mean, it's startling. So, I mean, I think the picture you painted is exactly the case. And I think it begins to strike you when you begin to compare not just simply the region, within the region, but you begin to compare with other regions in Africa. And we did the analysis,
yes.
And it's so clear that West Africa is the least commuted region. It's interesting because it's interesting for 2 reasons. One is that when you look, Nigeria makes up about 70% of the region. Now, even if you take Nigeria out of the picture, the region comes up just a couple of notches. So and it still falls below all the other regions, Central, Southern, Eastern, and Northern Africa. So it's that bleak. And we've gotten to that point, a crisis point. Inequality is so extreme.
And the point you're making is interesting because Nigeria has a considerable amount of the wealth in Africa.
Exactly.
So, I mean, if you compare it to other countries that are less wealthy, I mean, the economy of Lagos alone is bigger than that of Kenya. So it's astonishing that you have this much wealth and it's concentrated in the hands of such few people.
I think you've located the point, the heart of the paper in one sentence, and this is it. It's staggering because and I think the political point that needs to be made is that inequality is not inevitable. It's not fate. It's not predestined. It's actually a result of public policy and politics. And I think that's the point. So if a government, and that is why you have a couple of countries that seem to be making some steps towards tackling inequality, because those countries, those governments have made it a priority.
Right, we'll talk about that in a minute. But Hamzat, I suppose what makes this report of yours more stark is when it's viewed against the incredible growth of some of these countries. I mean, we're not just talking about the few people who are very wealthy, we're talking about the countries generally. For instance, Ghana, you know, and some of the other countries that are growing at, like, I mean, 5, 6, 7% a year.
Yes, and as much as they're growing, they're also putting tax burden on the very poor people, and that's what is really increasing the inequality. And if you look at this 1% of people who have acquired billions of dollar wealth, they're not being taxed, and this wealth is being stored in safe havens, in some offshore accounts in an island, and they still keep getting tax break from government policies. You know, they still enjoy royalties from government and their cronies in public offices, and this has helped fuel the inequality across the region. And for us, if we don't tackle this crisis, we might not even have a country, let alone a region, to even beat our chest and say we have that. And then when you compare us with other regions, and maybe let's even go to North Africa today. And if you look at how they have grown and ensure that they're able to ensure that small-scale, medium enterprise who also provide employment for over 50% of the unemployed young people, they ensure that they provide tax break to those kind of small SMEs and tax more luxurious driven businesses and individuals so that they can make more resources and fund social amenities that affect the poor people.
So basically, Oxfam's contention is that there is nothing inevitable in this inequality, as you mentioned, which is pretty much driven by political choices. And so you're saying that a different set of political choices from the ones currently in operation can help the region to address these inequalities.
That is exactly the case. And just to add to a point he made, I mean, your earlier question to Lawal was, you know, the massive growth in the region over the last decade. Quite frankly, just last year, 6 of the fastest growing economies were in this region.
Absolutely, fastest growing economies in the world.
Actually, 6 in West Africa and 4 out of the global. Well, so let me put it this way, a bit convoluted. But 6 of the fastest growing countries in Africa were from this region, and 4 of the fastest in the world were from here. So quite frankly, we have no basis to be the least committed. I mean, if the model of growth that is given as a solution to a problem is any solution at all. But so the point I'm trying to make is that we've seen such a massive growth, but that is not trickling down. It's been captured by a tiny and increasingly a small fraction of the populace. And just to cite one statistic. So in Nigeria, for example, just to give it a real human face, now a woman from a poorer home has 26 times less likely to get education, primary education, basic education. In Ghana, it's about 14%. And frankly, if you're not educating your people, what else are you doing?
Absolutely. That's a very, very critical point. So what are you hoping to achieve with this report that you've just released?
For us, we want to inform policy and decision making. We want to believe that probably our policymakers don't have access to this data. And for us, it's about making it public so that when they sit in the parliament, or when the executive wants to endorse any policy, they're endorsing it based on an informed perspective and using references from this inequality report, so that Nigeria can increase the benchmark and even compete with other countries in the continent, so that today you don't have to pay out of pocket to access healthcare service, or you don't have to worry that communities don't even have potable drinking water.
Yeah, and as Mr. Obeng said, their education is basic to lifting people out of poverty, but apparently 1 in 4 countries, from what I understand, is spending below the finance benchmark for education spending. And of course you have a fast rising population of children, especially in Nigeria, which means the country is pretty much off track as far as education is concerned.
If you look at the statistics around the world, Nigeria have the highest number of out-of-school children. That's over 10 million.
As well as having the highest number of people living in extreme poverty.
So that's one crisis waiting to explode. And if we don't tackle it now, it's going to explode on our faces. And mind you, today we have over 7 million people who are internally displaced in the Northeast alone. And if you look at the humanitarian crisis, again, this inequality report shows us that government have to rise to the occasion now more than ever before.
And obviously a key question in all of this is what is going to happen to fix the problem.
So,
go on.
No, carry on.
I was going to say that is something I'd like to, because I mean, it's one thing to paint an exceedingly bleak picture, which clearly you have. And a lot of people in Nigeria will say, and beyond Nigeria will say, well, you know, we knew it anyway. I mean, we sort of see people, you know, trundling down the streets penniless, and then you've got people riding around in sort of monstrously large jeeps and living in huge sort of houses and so on. But the key question is what's to be done to fix things?
So the report makes very clear, direct recommendations, specific. So remember, the report is built around 3 core pillars: social spending, progressive taxation, and labor rights. But for our region, and we think it's important, if you want to talk about and address inequality, you need to contextualize it. And the 2 contextual issues we included in the study, it's agriculture and land rights, because the bulk of our working population, in fact the poorest, depend on land for their livelihood. And so we provided specific recommendations. So I take the case of education.
Yeah, briefly, because we're going on a break shortly.
Malabo Declaration, the African Union, says that African governments should spend at least 10% of their budget on education. Many of our countries are doing between 2 to 3%.
Why do you think that's the case?
It's a political decision. It's a public policy decision.
So
not
they
to
don't think
invest.
education should be a priority, is that?
I think this is a question to a public official. But quite frankly, if they thought it was such an important area, which we think everybody knows that it is, because without education, they wouldn't be in the first place, manning the affairs of the countries in our region.
Are there places where things are going better than expected in West Africa? Are there places that we're doing badly but are now fulfilling the promise in West Africa?
Oh yes, and if you look at the report, it mentioned about 3 countries that are doing better. One of the countries, Cape Verde, and it shows it's all about political will. If you have political will, then you would be able to drive enabling policies that helps reduce inequality and provide better social amenities. But we highlighted these 3 countries so that countries like Nigeria and Ghana can take a leap. They can take a leap and come to think of it. If there is any crisis today in Nigeria, there's no country in Africa that can accommodate us. Well, there's a news report that we're now 190 million confirmed. So which country can accommodate 190 million? And when you look at the shrinking natural resources and other social vices, so again, it's an opportunity where policymakers can look at our report and say, okay, we need to go back and go back to the drawing board, bring out policies that empowers communities and give them access, for instance, access to land, access to credit and loan, so that they can engage in agricultural line businesses, and of course, reduce taxes on these individuals or small-scale companies.
Right, and that's the way, is it, that this inequality can be addressed? Because I have to be honest with you, I've been wondering, I mean, you know, if you're going to generate wealth quickly, and some of these countries have clearly done that, I mean, I've been wondering how it's going to be possible to arrange for a redistribution of that wealth.
So, I'll start off this way. Universal health coverage is the lowest in West Africa when you compare it with the other regions. In West Africa, it's just about a third. In a place like Kenya, it's about 47%. In Southern Africa, it's about 50 plus. So that's one. But the thing is that, remember, the region depends extensively on the extractive sector. Now, what we are saying is that the extractive sector, for example, offers us an opportunity to harness resources, because at the moment we're losing significant resources from that sector. I'll just go back to a report done by the AU, remember, in 2015, where they talked about illicit financial flows from Africa. It says at least $50 billion. Well, guess what? A third of that comes from our region. Now, you know the number of modern hospitals that could have been built? We could have built over 100 modern hospitals in 1 year. Now you put 100 hospitals, distribute them among the 15 countries. At least each country is going to take away about 5 to 7. Now that would transform the quality of life. So it's not as if we don't have the capacity, we don't have the means, we do. And so we're saying that one of the solutions is that governments must ensure that they put in place tax regimes that would allow us to be able to harvest the revenues we need to mobilize from multinational corporations that are giving basically unnecessary tax incentives. There's enough evidence around the world, from IMF, World Bank, OECD, UNECA, pointing out that companies don't look at the tax incentives. They're looking for stability in the policy. They're looking
so basically, Hamzat, the solution, just listening to Mr. Obeng there, the solution from your point of view is to adopt policy measures that will help redistribute the wealth and this growth that is happening in the region through, for instance, a better taxation system and better investment in social policies. And when we talk about social investment, we're talking about things like healthcare. Yes. So that way it trickles down and everybody feels like they're getting something.
Oh yes, and of course, in doing this, we also need to strengthen institutions, because politicians would come and go, but public institutions would remain. And when we, from our perspective, when we talk about strengthening institutions, we're talking about strengthening public servants. How can we enhance their capacity? Because today, when you look at our development index, it's quite low. Human capital index, it's all low. So for us to drive the inequality, reduce the inequality drive, we need to strengthen institutions and individuals in this institution. So it's sustainable over time. Mind you, if we start in a positive line, so when you have successive government, they would continue that policy because it addresses 100% of the population, not just looking at the 1% of people who have billions of dollars. So it's about, yes, strengthening institutions and having that sustainable means to drive this beyond just political will.
There's been a lot of talk, and I don't know if you're the right person to answer this because you're not Nigerian, but obviously you keep across what is going on. You are in Abuja, so hopefully you keep across. I mean, both of you, you all work together anyway. You're a pan-regional sort of international organization. There's been a lot of talk by the Nigerian government about social investment programs, like microcredit programs reaching many small businesses and low-income earners, creating small economic clusters, all that sort of thing. Is that a move in the right direction, or is there a sense that is just paying lip service?
So Nigeria is not unique in this context. Pretty much all the countries in the region are doing something around social protection, trying to improve. But you need a scale. A scale is important. And then also, what we've noticed around the region, and in this country as well, is that the people who are targeted, the people who need it most, are the ones that don't benefit. I'm not quite sure how this project can guarantee. I don't have the evidence to say it targets the people that ought to get the help they need.
Because in
to
fairness to the
transition.
point you're making, there have been historically a lot of programs like that, and the fate and the fortunes of people in that bracket never seems to change.
Exactly.
It just seems to get worse.
Yeah. But there's also a dimension to it. So ECOWAS has a role to play. ECOWAS needs to provide the leadership to allow these countries to work together.
That's the economic community of
exactly.
West African states, right?
And I think that the current work around the SDGs, for example, and African Union Agenda 2063 offers ECOWAS a kind of a focus to be able to offer a particular type of leadership and help, which it was set up to do in any case. I'm not too sure to what extent countries are getting help in terms of being able to address some of these things. So there is a regional dimension by way of what institutions like ECOWAS can help these countries to address some of these gaps. And just one last point. So there's been this work around how we harmonize tax incentives, tax regimes in the region to avoid a race to the bottom. Now that project somehow has not moved forward.
Right.
Now that is important to allow these countries to work together and not work against each other. At the moment, we're working against each other. And I think that Nigeria and ECOWAS ought to take leadership.
Right. That's a good point. Question, of course, is whether it can happen in reality. But let's talk again about Nigeria. That's because it stands out. Not only is it the biggest and arguably the wealthiest, but it's got the biggest number of problems. What can Nigeria do to, as it were, spring clean the system here and get the country out of this paralysis? We've identified 5 people, not by name, obviously,
yes,
but 5 people who control nearly $30 billion of wealth. What do? Do you go after those people and say, right, bring back some of that money? I mean, that's not likely to happen, is it?
So it's quite practical. For me, as a Nigerian and who have worked on the inequality campaign, we need to also create an enabling environment where we can create and harness this wealth.
No, I know. I understand that. We've established that you need to spend more on healthcare and more on education. But in order to do that, you've got to have the money.
How come?
And if 1% of the population controls 99% of the resources or whatever, it means that you're going to have to get some more of that back from them in order to spend it on those things. How do you propose to go about doing?
Well, this is where cooperation come in between governments of Nigeria and other international communities. So I remember in 2016, President Muhammadu Buhari, for instance, signed the Open Government Partnership, which is meant to provide public record of what wealth do you have, how do you acquire it, and where you stash this wealth, for instance. So that we can repatriate some of this wealth. 50 billion leaves the offshore of dollars, leaves the offshore of Africa, and we know that over 3% of that wealth is, or 30% of that wealth is from Nigeria. So what's important is to build more bilateral agreements where we can freeze this account and repatriate some of this money back into our economy. But then again, even if we do this and we don't build stronger institutions, this money will come back into the system, and some other people who have access to this money will steal them and also enrich themselves. So it's important that we sort of have a holistic approach towards ensuring that as this money is coming back, but beyond that also, so that this 1% of individuals does not continue milking the system.
Okay.
We need to strengthen policies and regulations around.
We're almost out of time. Mr. Obeng, you're from Oxfam's regional office in Dakar, Senegal. Senegal is one of the countries you cited in your report as doing well. Are there any lessons that can be learned from there? Briefly.
Yeah, sure. I'll be quick with this. 2 things. One is that people should make wealth, but genuinely, and the state must play its role. We're not saying that government should go and freeze people's wealth, or the report indicates that 2/3 of the wealth we're talking about is stored out of the region. The government can work with some of these people so they reinvest the resources in the region.